Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're tracing the explosive, constantly escalating timeline of the American colonies. We're going to watch them grow from these fragile, totally isolated settlements into a literal boiling pot of revolution. We're covering nearly 200 years of history here. And by looking at the specific sequence of laws, rebellions, and global conflicts, we'll see exactly how a handful of colonists completely transformed into an entirely new independent nation. So, we've got a massive amount of ground to cover across 6 distinct eras. We'll start with founding the first colonies, then trade and early rebellions, wars for dominance, the road to revolution, war and independence, and finally, forging a new nation. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Founding the first colonies from 1607 to 1650. It's actually wild how fast English colonization took root. Look at this. We moved from the very first permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607, which honestly barely survived its own infancy, to the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620. And then, boom, right into the Great Migration by 1630, where thousands of English Puritans just flooded into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, looking for religious freedom and land. Now, a major turning point in these early days was the headright system. See, early on, Jamestown went through a completely horrific period they called the starving time. They needed people and they needed them fast. So this brilliantly simple 1618 policy kind of saved the day. By basically handing out 50 acres of land to anyone who paid their own way over, the Virginia Company ended its monopoly and kick-started a massive, massive wave of migration. 66. That's how many grueling, dangerous days it took for the Pilgrim Fathers to cross the ocean on the Mayflower. Can you imagine? And it was actually during this incredibly arduous journey that they drafted their famous Mayflower Compact. They were literally setting up their own basic government before they even set foot in the New World. All right, moving on to Section 2. Trade and Early Rebellions, covering 1650 to 1696. So, the second half of the 1600s is basically defined by this intense back-and-forth struggle. England tries to lock down colonial trade with the 1651 Navigation Acts, to collect strict taxes, but the colonists, they push right back. This leads to major events like Bacon's Rebellion in 1675, and then a colonial revolt sparked by the Glorious Revolution in 1689. Eventually, the tension gets so incredibly high that England is forced to pivot, and they actually loosen their grip by 1696. To really understand England's motives during this whole tug-of-war, we've got to talk about mercantilism. This was the economic engine driving those restrictive navigation acts. To the British Crown, these colonies weren't just some remote outposts, right? No, they were a highly lucrative source of wealth. Through these massive cash crop plantations, the colonies were essentially expected to be a profit engine, fueling the homeland. But here's what's truly fascinating. After decades of trying to strictly enforce that mercantilism and dealing with constant pushback, the British Board of Trade effectively just takes a step back. In 1696, they pivot to a policy called salutary neglect, which essentially gave the American colonies considerable freedom in their own economic matters. Unwittingly, Great Britain gave the colonists a profound taste of freedom and self-management. And let me tell you, that's a taste they would fiercely defend later on. Which brings us to Section 3. Wars for Dominance, from 1702 to 1763. As the colonies grew larger and, frankly, way wealthier, they became the ultimate prize in a series of incredibly violent global conflicts. These proxy wars between European empires just steadily escalated. It started with Queen Anne's War in 1702, moved right into King George's War in 1744, and it all culminated in the massive continent-spanning French and Indian War, which finally wraps up in 1763. Now, a really vital point to remember here is that these weren't just simple European conflicts fought on foreign soil. Not at all. They involved deeply complex strategic alliances with Native American confederations. Native tribes were fighting on both sides. You had the Wabanaki and Choctaws aligning with the French, while the Iroquois and Chickasaw allied with the British. Everyone involved was fighting for survival, for leverage, and for territorial dominance in a rapidly changing landscape. Ultimately, the British won that struggle, and the resulting 1763 Peace Treaty of Paris fundamentally redrew the map of North America. France was actually forced to hand over its lands east of the Mississippi River, granting Great Britain this unprecedented sweeping dominance over the continent. But, as we're about to see, this massive victory came at a staggering financial cost. And that brings us right into Section 4, the Road to Revolution, from 1763 to 1775. Notice how the pace of history completely shifts gears here. We aren't looking at events spanning decades anymore. Things are now rapidly escalating year by year. With the French defeated, Britain tried to reverse its long-held policy of salutary neglect to pay off its massive war debts. And every single new British law sparks a more organized, more violent colonial reaction. From the Sugar Act in 1764 to the bloodshed of the Boston Massacre in 1770, right up to the famous Boston Tea Party in 1774. I mean, just look at this. The British Parliament unleashed a relentless sequence of taxation, trying to squeeze the colonists tighter and tighter. They taxed sugar, then legal papers, then glass, paints, paper, and finally tea. This intense direct economic pressure led straight to the formation of patriot organizations. Groups like the secret society known as the Sons of Liberty popped up, actively agitating for resistance and organizing massive boycotts against British goods. So the boiling pot finally overflows after the Boston Tea Party. In furious retaliation, Britain passed a package of laws known as the Intolerable Acts. Looking at these 5 steps, from the Boston Port Act all the way to the Quebec Act, it is literally a masterclass in how a government attempts to absolutely crush a rebellion. But here's the catch. Locking down ports and forcing colonists to quarter soldiers didn't restore authority at all. It only united these fiercely independent colonies further against a common enemy. And the ultimate breaking point arrives in March of 1775. Patrick Henry delivers his passionate, fiery speech containing these immortal words: "Give me liberty or give me death." That was it. The era of peaceful debate, boycotts, and non-importation agreements was officially over. The pot had completely boiled over. Section 5, War and Independence, from 1775 to 1783. The colonies are now officially at war, entering a period that would fundamentally change the course of human history. Driven by the immediate demands of armed conflict against the greatest military power on Earth, the Continental Congress rapidly transformed from a simple advisory body into an acting revolutionary government. By July 1776, they made the ultimate leap, signing the Declaration of Independence. And by 1781, they had enacted their very first framework for national government, the Articles of Confederation. But the monumental challenge lay in the number 13. We often take it for granted today, but these were 13 entirely distinct British colonies. I mean, they had completely different economies, different religious foundations, and totally differing loyalties. Yet, to survive, they had to somehow unite, turn themselves into independent states, and fight as one unified front under the newly formed Continental Army. Which leads us to our 6th and final era, forging a new nation, from 1783 to 1799. The fires of revolution have finally cooled down, and the grueling, highly complex work of building a permanent government begins. This post-colonial period was an absolute race against time. The new nation had to urgently organize vast western land claims stretching all the way to the Mississippi River, which they managed through policies like the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. But even more importantly, they had to establish a unified legal framework before this incredibly fragile new union of states simply fell apart from infighting. As we wrap up this explainer, just consider the stark contrast between these two frameworks. The original Articles of Confederation, that was just a wartime framework, and it proved way too weak to hold a nation together during peacetime. States were objecting to central authority, refusing land claims. It was a mess. So they actually had to completely scrap it for the U.S. Constitution in 1789, permanently unifying the states under the first United States Congress and President George Washington. Looking back at how they navigated this chaotic 200-year struggle, from those starving settlers in Jamestown to a brand new constitutional republic, how does understanding this explosive timeline change the way you view the very foundations of modern democracy?